And I want to call up our other panelists here. First, William Hines, who's a visiting professor in the College of Business and Law at the University College of Cork and has a background in planning and development. I think we're working on, there we go. Okay, there's William. Also, Stefan Trometer. Stefan is a local here for us. We're going global from Freiburg. He's the head of Urban Simulation Division in the Virtual City Systems. Has a PhD from the Technical University and is bringing us an industry perspective. And we just heard a good bit about Christchurch, and our longest distance traveler for the panel here is John Vargo, who is from Christchurch, New Zealand. He's the Executive Director of Resilient Organizations. So please all join me here, and we will get started with a conversation about the benefits of how we make the case for the benefits of investing in resilience. So, John, I'm going to put you on the spot first, because we heard a bit about Christchurch and the impact on the business center, and I suspect that has animated some of your work here. So what I'd like to ask maybe each of you there is how you've come to the resilience focus here, and my understanding is the Christchurch event certainly animated a bit of your work.
Yeah, you'd be right there, Steve. Thank you very much. And Michelle, thank you. Such an interesting talk. Certainly many things are being stimulated. In terms of my own background, I'm originally from Detroit, so my accent doesn't quite line up with the Kiwi anticipation you might have had. But I've lived in Christchurch for over 30 years. I hope that doesn't mean disasters are following me, because Detroit's been a bit of a disaster of its own. How did I end up getting into the area of resilience? My original background, I did a bachelor's degree in accounting at the University of Michigan and was in auditing, and of course that deals with financial risk. So the risk area in thinking about organizations, and then when I moved to New Zealand I segued into computer security, and so that was sort of the second piece. So there's both some technical aspects there, but also a keen interest on the people side of things. And then 15 years ago, my colleague Erica Seville started Resilient Organizations as a research program within the University of Canterbury and right across the country in New Zealand, funded by central government. And I was her first recruit. I was dean of the business school at the time, and I dropped my other research interests because this was such an interesting idea that she had. And so I've been involved in organizational resilience for 15 years, which is very transdisciplinary. We're now independent of the university, but still linked. A small team of 8, and we've got 2 civil engineers. We've got me with a business background. We've got a sociologist. We've got an org psych person who's on the one of the finalists for the Young Researchers Award. So we got a very transdisciplinary team and interested in looking across those boundaries. So if you want to know how I describe myself, I'd probably describe myself and Resilient Organizations as a boundary spanner. We're interested in those broad perspectives to bring to this quite serious problem and complex problem of resilience. The difficulty is it's not just a complex problem. Some of you have come across the term probably VUCA, V-U-C-A. If you haven't, it stands for volatile. U stands for uncertain, then the C is complex, and the A stands for ambiguity. And you actually have all 4 of those things happening in the world that we're living in today across the boundaries of these complex systems that we're dealing with. And to the extent that we ignore those will be the extent that we don't match up theory with reality. And so I think that's a pretty important aspect. So that's my background. Christchurch. We just heard about the disaster in Christchurch. A comment, from an engineering standpoint, we're still under reconstruction. But what was the impact of this massive earthquake sequence on Christchurch economically? There was almost no impact at all. Our business failure rate was pretty much the same before and after and during. And the reason is because the individuals and the organizations had happy relationships even with their competitors, and so they just moved out into the suburbs. They moved into their garage. They moved into a competitor's facility that was undamaged. People did leave Christchurch, but we probably never really lost very much of our population because the businesses stayed because of good government policy. And that policy was, if you're a small business with fewer than 50 employees, the government will provide you with funding for 6 weeks to pay your employees. And that was in place within 1 week of the earthquake in September and the big earthquake in February. So that's good policy because it happened quickly, it was easily accessible, and removed the risk and the uncertainty for those business people. Therefore, the job stayed. Because the job stayed, the population stayed, even though there was some churn in it. So I'm describing some things that can help with resilience and give us some of the benefits of building a resilient environment, which includes those connections, because we had a really strong connection between our Chamber of Commerce president and the treasurer of the New Zealand government. And so one phone call and a few conversations and this policy was in place. And so those are key aspects of building a resilient community on the back of the importance of having infrastructure that actually functioning.
Great. Thank you for that, John. Stefan, you're helping out with the tools that we often need to understand risk better. And I know your virtual city systems is a part of that effort. And as somebody coming from the business sector and developing solutions for resilience or a tool to support the development of resilience, so one, how have you come to this, and how do we make the case, in your experience, of the benefit of using the tools you're developing?
Yes. I have a background in civil engineering, and now I'm representing Virtual City Systems here. We are a small upcoming company, and we are experts for 3D city models based on a semantic strategy, on a database, on a data model. And our main group of customers are cities like Berlin or Hamburg, like Rotterdam, Helsinki, also Singapore. But we mainly talk to the surveying departments and the planning departments. We believe that our approach of semantic city modeling has huge potential also for further applications. And so I, as responsible for business development, we try to find new fields of application. So we try to link our technologies for city modeling with further applications. And so we have a history, and not a too long distant history, but we cooperate with the EMI here in Freiburg on different topics to linking their solutions with our city modeling in the field of earthquake vulnerability, in the field of supporting ordnance clearance services, in the field of urban safety and security. And of course, we try to develop solutions for the future by linking the technologies from others with our city modeling approaches. And of course, we really want to bring these solutions to the customers. And of course, as I'm sitting here as not a specialist for resilience, I really would like to encourage you as researchers to partner with private sector companies to bring your research, your findings, to bring them to the market, and by this to bring them to a sustainable benefit.
Great, thank you. And now if I could turn to William Hines, who I think you deal with some of these issues in a more macro scale, right? You've been an urban planner and a transportation planner, and you've been thinking about communities and how they should be designed. How have you got into the resilience space from the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you very much, and again, thank you to the MI Fraunhofer for giving me the opportunity to talk here today. So I am an urban planner, an urban economist, and at the center of what we do is evidence-based solutions. I was in industry and for many years, and then in 2000 I became a full-time academic in University College Dublin, and lectured there as an urban planner, transport planner, but particularly in the area of demographic and population analysis. And in 2008, and we all have a fair idea of what happened in 2008 globally, like all good planners, I left my secure, comfortable, full-time position in academia, and I went into industry. That was really good planning. But so then we set up an SME called Future Analyst Consulting, and we now work very closely with industry, in the private sector, with the public sector, with municipal authorities, government bodies, and also in the applied research space, particularly within Europe in the FP7 Horizon 2020 space. And I suppose in that, say, 8, 9, 10 years space or period since we've been working in Future Analyst Consulting, we've really entered and engaged in the space of resilience. Just to give you one practical example that we're currently working on with the municipality of Dublin, which is our largest city in Ireland, and it's our capital city. And just to give you some very high-level stats, so in 2008, if you can imagine this, at the start of 2008, and our national, say, unemployment rate was just under 5%. So that's almost like full-point employment in our country. That unemployment rose radically to just 15% in 2012. In a 4-year period, we had now over 15% unemployment. Where we are today, in August, the latest figure that's out there, August 2018, we're just over 5% again unemployment. So we talk about resilience. We as a country and as a society, we have really sustained and absorbed resilience on a very day-to-day basis. What that means then for Dublin City, and the work we're doing with Dublin City is, over that period, there's been ebbs and flows in demographic and population growth. However, now, in the city, there's a huge surge in population growth. The biggest driver for us, for Ireland, in terms of population challenge, is migration. We are a small, open economy, so migration has a massive impact on our city and our cities and our environment and our economy. So we've had to deal with those massive insurgents of migration, both nationals coming back and non-nationals coming in because of the opportunity employment now. Bringing that back to resilience, and it's great to see now that the European Commission have categorized housing as a critical infrastructure and really important in the resilience space. So we work very closely with the City Council in trying to determine the demographic growth and population change and the composition of that change and the need for the provision of really sustainable housing, resilient housing for our citizens going forward. And we're moving from a period of huge, say, owner-occupier housing in our state now to a space where the percentage growth in rental is really important, and we have to accommodate that rental space. So that resilience of our city for Dublin is very important, that we accommodate, we grow, and we provide the proper infrastructure, particularly housing, to make our city very, very resilient. And in doing that, we're learning an awful lot from the Viennese model. If you understand the Viennese housing model that's developed over the last 100 years. And they built that model on huge inward migration into Vienna firstly, and then also the huge issue of housing and social housing and the need for social housing. We're facing those similar issues now, and again, we need to really understand that for a city to become more resilient for our citizen. And at the end of the day, while we have engineering, we have transport, we have services, we have finance, we have all of the other issues of critical infrastructure, at the end of the day, the most important person, the most important end user is our citizen and society within that. And that's where we really need to focus our attention on, in the provision for proper resilient infrastructure for our citizen.
That's great. We're already picking up, a theme about what's animating the need for resilience is disruption, and the disruptions can be of a broad set of issues. John, you were laying out your own evolution in your career with financial sort of focus, accounting focus, business continuity, but then now the cyber piece that into here, and clearly, Michel, your work around structures and buildings right there, and developing new tools to help us understand dependencies and interdependencies and models and simulation for planning, which is fundamentally about the dynamism, right, that we're trying to bring into our community. and the disruption of the economy dipping and then coming back, and how we sort of think that through. But I think that the one thing we can count on is, as a constant, is disruption, is the turbulence, right? And so we all have solutions, and Michel, you had one that you put up at the end here, your FCOT resilience. What I might ask each of you, because I think this is a challenge for all of us, is what is perhaps the biggest barrier that you have, that you're running into of keeping your solutions from being widely adopted? I'm sure there's more than one, but if we can focus on maybe a couple of them there, that would be helpful. What are the barriers that we'd have to overcome from your experience here to make some of your vision reality?
I think the barriers and the benefits are somewhat tied together. One of the focus I've had in the past 10 years is coming up with structural systems that would be faster to repair and easier to recover from after an earthquake. And what's pretty clear is that the costs have to be just about the same. If it's 5%, 10% more expensive, it's already a killer there. So the benefits there that we have to emphasize is that for the same price, you get a better system. Mm-hmm. And it's designed maybe for the same strength, so maybe your robustness is the same, but without having to pay a premium, if you go for this instead of that, you're going to have, in the case of an event, a faster return to service.
So why isn't that just being embraced then, if it's not so much?
I
in your
think
case
part of it is
cost
it's fairly new. Mm-hmm. We're seeing in Christchurch, all of the systems that are being used already have that. Mm-hmm. And it's a slow transition. As you were mentioning, the 30-year time that it takes. Buckling restraint braces that I've shown have been developed in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And now they're common practice in California. Mm-hmm. So it's a process. It takes time for engineers to be comfortable with it. There's a level of conservatism inside the profession. There's rightly so, because people are dealing with human lives in buildings that collapse, right? So we don't want that to happen. Now, the challenge for research, though, if I can turn that around, is that it's the research funding agencies, I think, that are not necessarily in the United States in a position right now where they wish to fund that work, because it's more interesting to fund gadgets or things like that can create markets, right? It's sad to say, but after an event where there are deaths, there's more interest all of a sudden to fund research in that area. And that's one of the issues, I guess, maybe in civil engineering, is we're in an area where we're trying to ensure the well-being of society, but that's not always translatable in immediate products or dollars right away. That creates some challenges.
Okay. So clearly jump into some barriers in the policy realm, right? And if they're not set up as building code, they're not required, in other words, then sometimes banks won't give you financing for doing extra stuff if it looks different, right? So there's a whole mix of things that really get at the heart of the speed at which we take a best practice and get it widely adopted, right? I mean, and that's part of hopefully the value of having this kind of group in conversation.
Yes, you've mentioned a number of very good points, but interestingly, the codes tend to follow the implementation, and that once there has been a couple of implementations, then the codes decide to codify it sometimes. It's kind of the other way around as what you would think. Right. And what we've seen that in structural engineering, the BRBs were being used and implemented in California, then the building code says, oh, maybe we should write something about that.
There you go. John, from your work, what is the barriers that you have run into to get folks to embrace resilient organizations?
I think I'd like to touch on two key barriers very briefly. The first one is the measurement issue, which Michel was touching on. So I really like the people's model. There are similar models, multi-capital models. Mm-hmm. The problem is much of our decision making isn't based on that. It's based on the financial and built infrastructure. That's where so much of our decision making is made. And something that captures my concern in this area is a quote from Robert Kennedy. So I'll just read it to you. And it's, you have to follow the metaphor. He said, the gross national product does not include the beauty of our poetry or the intelligence of our public debate. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And so I think we have this profound, what we measure has a profound impact on how we approach the risks that we're facing as humanity. And so I urge us as a group really to be careful about not focusing too much of the effort on just the financial and built infrastructure side of it. Although they're very important, we clearly can't ignore them, but finding ways to quantify the qualitative, I think, is one aspect. The second thing I wanted to touch on really is the approach that we take to our standard practices, and especially with regard to risk. Many of our 21st century standard practices were designed for the first machine age. Okay, that's now 200 years ago. We've now entered the second machine age, where AI, where Moore's Law are beginning to have a substantial impact on the risks that we face and the way we deal with things. But we're still using risk models and thinking from 200 years ago, which are very useful for the known. But now we have so many things that are unknown, not because we don't know about them, but because you might have 5 things hit you at one time. You have some big event, and then you have some latent 2 or 3 others that become cascading risks that fall into your face, and you've got some fragility in some part of the community, and they all bang together, and all of a sudden our planning is no longer working. And so I'd like to suggest an approach. I don't think it's unique, but moving from this concept where risk is something to be avoided, to be passed on to somebody else through insurance, to be mitigated. I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things. I think we should, but I think we need a parallel way of thinking about risk, where we embrace risk. Because stop and think. When you went to school, I don't know about Germany, but in the U.S., when you went to school, you're rewarded for absolutely minimizing your mistakes. And in most workplaces, you are absolutely rewarded for minimizing your mistakes. And yet, how do we learn? We learn by mistakes. We learn by getting something wrong, having someone show us how to get it right, and then improving. Well, I think that's a parallel stream of how we should be dealing with risk, because we need to embrace risk, because most organizations are very risk averse, and so they're not learning organizations. They're not going to be quick at learning or putting into practice new ideas. Steve, you were asking that question about how can we speed up this process. Well, resilient organizations, we've been at this for 15 years, and we probably thought 15 years ago that by 20 years we would have this problem solved. Well, I think 30 years is a whole lot closer to the reality of the complexity. We need to change the way we approach risk, or at least add a new stream to that. So we're embracing risk, we're accelerating the process of employing risk to help us learn more quickly, and encouraging that within our organizations. Within constraint, obviously you don't want to bet the house on someone doing something silly. But I think that's such an important process, because that is the only way we're going to stay ahead of the rapid change that we're experiencing. Just bouncing back to where we were, the changes are going to race right past us. So we have to be bouncing forward, and I think this is a critical approach to bouncing forward, is that innovation that comes through risk-taking.
Great. And I think that's clearly a theme, Michel, that came from your work where buildings were just, if I accomplish the goal of life safety, that the building did not fail in terms of killing people as the ground moved, then that was success, right? So our definition of risk, though, is not necessarily the one that really, and that's where functionality becomes really key, right? And that focus on function. But the comfort level of dealing with risk is something that we're struggling with, right? The political side often is to make these promises. I can create a zero-risk world if I build a wall. It turns out to have appeal, because the contrary narrative actually is risk is how I learn, risk is how I, through mistakes and so forth, grow and expand. That's a key part of this dialogue, right? Stefan, as you're I know in the, again, entrepreneurial side of things, of building things out, what are some of the things that you're running into relative to scaling or getting a wider base of support for the tools that you're developing?
Yes, from my point of view, it's quite challenging, the complexity we face, and we heard it from all of the contributions today already. There are a lot of different points of view, different aspects, and of course you can build a building which stands for earthquakes, but then there might be other problems. So we see a complex situation if something happens. So we have addressed a lot of different people, and if we then try to find solutions and to bring the solutions to bring the solutions into application, we also have the situation that there are most of the time a lot of different stakeholders which have to be involved. So establish business, we really have to find a solution which leads to a win-win situation, or especially a win-win situation for every stakeholder, for every party involved. So, which is also not a face-by-face selling something situation. And of course, if we more basically look at the city as the place where we live, cities are extraordinarily complex, and we have to overcome this complexity, and we see it in city modeling. Of course, you have to start at a certain place, like retrofitting buildings for earthquakes, but then you have to take other issues, other points of view into account to make it more complex, to really address the needs of the certain stakeholders. And in this process I think that modern technology support this way, and I think that we are really at the break point to deliver comprehensive systems which address a lot of these issues.
Great. Maybe we'll continue on, this challenge of how we bring all these various constituencies together. I mean, you wrestle that within an urban planning kind of set of challenge, right? What's the barrier that's keeping essentially folks from taking these comprehensive solutions where we could get win-wins? And perhaps how have you been able to overcome it?
So I would look at them more as challenges than barriers. And I think you used the word, Stephen, challenges as well. And I will go one more than John. I will say, for us, we have three that I'd like to say focus on at a high level. And the three being is the various, say, operational, organizational structures that the entities are working in. So if you take the public sector, for example, the national, regional, and local operational issues that they have to deal with. Then matching that, the private sector, together with the infrastructure owners, operators, and then the citizen. So trying to work within all those situations is very complex, and that can create challenges. However, there are opportunities in that space as well. That's what we see. We see the opportunities and the solutions around that particular space. The second one then is it's linked to the organization operation structures, but it's the ability to be able to respond to various issues, various concerns, various events, and to be able to respond rapidly and efficiently. And the response to that is for us, it's based on really good monitoring and evaluation tools and techniques that you can see then under particular scenarios that's happened. You can respond to that either as a city council or a government body or a private sector entity to respond to that, but yet you're using tried and tested M&E approaches. And the third then, say, challenge, and it's been touched on earlier by our keynote speaker, is information and data. In the space that we are in, data is absolutely so important, and evidence-based data, and to be able to use that data to come up with best practice and enhanced solutions. Taking that information and that data, linking it in with the previous point about really good evidence-based monitoring evaluation tools and techniques, and then showing then those to the entities, the public, the private, the citizen, showing that evidence-based, that can help overcome some of the challenges that are in this operational space as well. So it links it all back again. And I think if you get a handle on that and really show the evidence-based outputs of that, then you will bring people with you. So in the space that we're in, we're a small SME, but we've got the kind of the terminology now, or the name almost, as being a positive disruptor, which is really good because we're out there, we're disrupting, but we're trying to do it in a very positive way to give evidence-based solutions.
Great. Thank you. I want to now turn to our broader participants out here for some questions that you may have of the panel. So who would like to get started? I think we have some microphones that will be available. We got one right here in the middle.
Hello, Alondra Tamoro from Sijidan, Chile. I'm curious about the effect of the insurance model in Christchurch. Did it impact really resilience or the speed where all the system is getting to the normal operation? And also the decision of demolishing and rebuilding rather than rehab the existing infrastructure and buildings.
Just so you're aware of the background on Christchurch, we ultimately demolished somewhere between 70 and 80% of our central business district buildings. So that's huge. The financial impact nationally was 20% of GDP. That was the financial impact of the Christchurch earthquake, which is off the charts, really, if you compare it to Hurricane Katrina, which was about 4 or 5% of GDP in the U.S., Tohoku, about 5% in Japan, 20% in Christchurch. So it's gigantic. And the question about insurance, we are the best insured country in the world. 80% of our losses were insured. And so the question is that a good thing? Well, it sounds like a good thing, and it is from a long-term standpoint. It means we're going to have this fabulous inventory of new, well-built, earthquake-resistant, highly energy-efficient buildings in a wonderful new central city. Much better than it was before. And it was one of the world's great small cities before. But I would say it's slowed down the process of reconstruction considerably because it takes time to get the insurers to agree with the engineers, to agree with the owners as to whether should we demolish or repair this building. I'll give you an example. The building I was in on the day of the February earthquake was the Commerce Building on the University of Canterbury's campus. It's only just 6 months ago they started working on repairing that building, and they had to strip it right back to its concrete pillars and posts. So there's nothing left apart from that fundamental structure and the rebuilding it. When the university wanted to demolish it and build a purpose-built building in that place, but they couldn't agree based on about 10% differential. And so it slowed the process down. So from a speed of recovery, resilience, probably not so good being so well insured. In fact, we probably demolished twice as many buildings as we would have if we were more poorly insured because it was economic. It wasn't economic to rebuild them if you had full insurance to replace them. But part of, really, my answer to your question is this. Resilience is a multidimensional, complex concept. And you're going to have some things that look really good and other things that don't look so good at all. And you have to weigh them up to say, well, where's the best place to be in that? And there's not a simple answer to that. It's a complicated equation. I don't think you can put the numbers into a machine and pop out with an answer at the end. You know, it's our values impact on that.
Michel?
That's a very good question. To also tie it to a previous comment you had made, you may look at it in two ways. One is, what was the impact of the insurance industry on the building codes to promote the use of better structural system, right? And the impact is zero. They don't care. They are insuring unreinforced masonry buildings in Christchurch just as any other building, even though we know unreinforced masonry buildings are death traps, right, in earthquakes. And that's because the insurance industry reinsures itself with Munich Re, Swiss Re, and what have you. So to them, they'll pass on the bill. And to the reinsurance industry, New Zealand is 0.1% of their total portfolio, so it doesn't count. And so, in fact, the earthquake, the price of insurance increased after the earthquake and came back down to normal a few years after because there was not that many disasters worldwide in the following years, so the reinsurance market was essentially able to wash that up over time. What the insurance industry did, though, and that ties up a little bit to what you mentioned, is that if I have an insurance and it says same as new, will replace to same as new. So you have a reinforced concrete building that has had some deformations, and we call those plastic hinges. And in those plastic hinges, the rebars have stretched and compressed and maybe, buckled a little bit. So to make it same as new, you'd say, well, that's not same as new. It has been worked out. And so I want a new rebar to be same as new. So to take a new rebar out, you have to chip out the concrete so that you can take it out of the beam. You have to take it, chip out the concrete so you can take it out of the column. But if you chip out the column, you've got no column left. So you have to shore the floors. And you start adding all the expenses that it would take to replace all these rebars. And you say, well, that's becoming silly. Might as well tear it down and build a brand new building. So there's the incentive once you have the insurance money to buy a new building. But you also, as you say, if I had no insurance and I had a banged up building, you can make an analogy with these cars. Some people drive around with bent up fenders. They don't mind. So you probably would have had a few buildings that would have been patched up. Some of them probably should not have been patched up, but would have been patched up. Others might have been okay. And so it would have painted a slightly different picture in those terms.
So I think it's obviously a very important area is the role of insurance in either rewarding bad behavior to some extent, not incentive good behavior. But there are also different products, and I think that's important to keep in mind. One is, increasingly parametric insurance, which are trigger events that lead a lot of money going quickly. Resources matter, right, and be able to recover quickly. Just an example, the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York City, the largest in the United States, it has a parametric for flooding if they have another hurricane. That allows them to have contracts in place to do immediate cleaning of electromechanical systems that are likely to be compromised by salt water. Right, so they have the contracts in place because they know the money will come immediately, and they can therefore deploy and potentially save a lot of equipment that if time was left to wait for other resources to come, they would not be able to accomplish, right? So just a stretching that we want to be able to do here about how insurance could be supportive, because it's not necessarily so. That's, I think, what we captured here. Another question? Yes, right here.
Thanks very much. Tim Pryor, ETH Zurich. I like the people's model. It kind of represents a lot of the multidimensionality of resilience. What I'm missing is like the decision making at the political level, which I think is, if you think about resilience as a system, we need to incorporate political decision making in that system. So how do we do that? And if we can do that in a meaningful way, is that going to help us? I mean, decision makers make decisions about disasters when disasters happen, not before. As individuals and householders, we're told to prepare well before a disaster. We do that as a business as well. That increases our resilience. How do we move that thinking to political decision makers who are working on very short time frames, much shorter than individuals even, probably?
Great. Why don't we focus that on, in terms of response to the panel, on elected officials? How do we get elected officials potentially to help make the right choices? Any advice on that one?
I can give it a go. I think taking the Irish context and the various shocks and bounce backs and bounce forwards that we've had over the last decade and beyond, what the government of Ireland and the political parties of Ireland have realised now that decisions about, say, resilience and risk and being prepared and being preventative is no longer single party, that cross-party discussions, policies and approaches have to be adapted and used, which is very important. So there's now many, say, working groups within the elected members that are overcoming those issues and being more prepared and more responsive to disasters of one kind or another, be it man-made or be it natural. So I think that is a very important initiative, because it gives longevity to the issue and addressing that. And as you rightly said, that there's a very short time frame for an elected member to be considering of these issues, and then if you can bring it more cross-party, it gives it longevity and a longer consideration. And that is really happening in Ireland currently.
I'd like to just comment on Billy's comment as well. And that's the issue that democracy in the West is facing some serious problems of short-term decisions to solve long-term problems. And they usually produce a whole host of unintended consequences we don't really want. And part of that problem is the chasm that's opened up between the right and the left, and not just in the U.S., lots of other places as well. And as a result, we've got a government where you've got a low trust of the citizenry toward government and between the different opposing parties within government. And I think that's a critical thing that has to be addressed. If we can rebuild trust, we can then get long-term solutions that carry on from one elected government to another, and decisions that meet the needs of the population, not just the needs of some lobby group or a particular worldview. And so I think that rebuilding is a critical piece that we need to rediscover.
Stefan?
Yes, I totally agree. And of course, the political issue, especially as we or some of you as well are coming from engineering perspective, is difficult sometimes. But on the other side, I'm quite happy that from the politics, some funding programs are launched, federal funding programs which support user-oriented, goal-oriented research, which really tries to bring the solution towards application and which is a little bit more long-term oriented. So I guess that this helps at least a little bit to overcome this general problem.
That's great.
Obviously, I'm not a political scientist, but I just want to add one comment to that. I've observed that, and many of you have done too, that governments tend to be reactive rather than proactive. And because of that, those who had a plan in place and were just waiting for the window to open, usually were able to squeeze in stuff right after a disaster. So you usually have a window of about 18 months to 2 years after a disaster where they're looking for solution madly. It falls within their political windows of elections and what have you. And so lots of cases have been made where people can say, oh, here's something that you may wish to use, and that's falling right within the window. Of course, you need a disaster for that window to open. That's the problem.
I think this idea of a disaster is a terrible thing to waste. It's kind of part of that there is a need to recreate and bounce back, and one of the limitations of recovery often is that is trying to be, those best practices are not baked into recovery, and you're trying to do it after the fact here. I would just highlight another, and I think this is key about what we're wrestling with, how to communicate resilience is a theme I think we're running through, we'll run through all our work here. But to the degree that we're starting from disruption and risk, often the human nature side of that, I'd rather not think about that. But inverting this into a realm where we start to see this as a competitive advantage, I'll just share one way which we engaged in the Metro Seattle area is by bringing in the key industry players, Starbucks, Amazon, Boeing, and Microsoft, as a part of a conversation about the post-Cascadia megaquake scenario and the disruption that would have to all the lifeline sectors. I could have kissed the guy from Starbucks because as this conversation was going back and forth between the public and the private owners and operators of these systems, he basically said, look, I don't know how much time it is, but I can just say, a starting off point, we love Seattle. Our founder's from Seattle. People drink a lot of coffee in Seattle. But here's the deal. You don't get your act together, we're out of here. And that was pretty much nodding from Microsoft and nodding from Amazon and nodding from Boeing. And you can see the color drain from the faces of both the private owner-operators of the systems as well as the public ones, going, okay, if they all leave, they may not be coming back, all those other players would go. Well, that's the few, but if you invert that, if you are actually working up front to build a more resilient community, there's no place that's risk-free, that's going to be a place that people who have a choice of where to invest and where to live are going to come. And so if we start to sort of message this as a competitive advantage, as really an opportunity, because folks are going to be constantly shopping for where to go, and this is something I think you can start to turn the tide perhaps a little bit in the right direction. But again, so a bigger theme here of communication. Okay, we're down to our last few minutes before lunch, so we can take one more question from the crowd. Okay, we're back here to the center.
I liked very much the framing of Billy Hines, yeah, who moved from barriers to challenges, and maybe we could move one step forward towards opportunities, like you as business leaders. So which type of engineering solution would you see as a big chance, as a business chance? This would be one question. The other question would be maybe which type of engineering solution would be a big chance for insurance makers or reinsurance. Do you see there anything where you could really make a cash cow out of such a solution?
Great. And before you answer that, or anyone here, I'm going to take this other question right over here, and then we'll combine them together, okay? So I had one right over here in the middle. There we go.
Thank you. I'm Raina from the National Institute of Urban Affairs in India. The discussion that has been going on and what we have been talking since morning, it's pretty interesting to see. But I think from the context of developing economies, I think a big challenge is also the scale and pace of, urbanization and migration. So William was talking about how cities and urban planning and infrastructure needs to look at resilience. But how do we address that scale and pace of urbanization? So for example, in India, we have huge cities, coming up. So while there is a body of research, there is, that discussion happening, but we don't know how to start and where to start. So any thoughts on that?
Okay. Very, very important questions from two parts of the spectrum here. All right. Who wants to take this on? Either one of them.
I can have a go at both very quickly, though, because I'm mindful of the other experts up here. Thank you, Ivo. You're asking about maybe potential engineering solutions. Personally speaking, I think the solutions are more multifunctional. It's bringing in engineering, it's bringing in urban planning, urban design, architecture, it's bringing in human health, societal and social factors as well. So it's a very multifunctional solution. And because if we're looking at the urban fabric, urbanism is a very complex process. And I think it needs to be addressed because, as we all know, as the UN have put out there, by 2050, 75% of our global population is going to be urbanized. And that's why we need this multifunctional approach. To touch on the lady's point from India, I fully agree with your point. We're very luckily to be involved in a Horizon 2020 project, and one of our end user partners is the University and City Council of Walaita Sodo in Ethiopia. Our project is called Building Resilience Through Education, and we're working with the university and the council of looking at how we in Ireland have done urban planning and urban development in a sustainable, resilient space, and bringing some of those, say, approaches and methodologies to them, but also being very mindful of their, say, underlying, say, situation, their infrastructure, their knowledge base and expertise. So it's a very much a knowledge sharing and transfer, and working with them in that space to enhance both sides of the equation's knowledge of the whole resilient space. So again, but very different factors in both situations.
Great. And Stefan?
Yeah, just a short amendment also to the question from the lady from India. Of course, it's a challenge, but I guess that our digital solutions and digital technologies really help and support to spread the ideas and to implement them also in developing countries and other places. So solutions from us, for example, we develop with some lighthouse cities like Rotterdam and Helsinki, but even small municipalities can have benefit from this, because it's the same to apply the result in a small municipality, and especially if we just try to apply such strategies. That's, of course, there are some challenges as well if we want to bring this to developing countries and to other countries, but I guess that digitalization really helps, and it really lowers the gap to step into such a development.
Great. John?
My response really is with regard to city function in these rapidly growing large cities. just a piece of advice from somebody who's got a new city growing around him in Christchurch. Make sure your new cities have a high capacity for human joy. Christchurch is going to be so much more livable city than the previous city was. Easier to get around, easier for people to interact with one another. And also, just one closing comment from me. Many of you would be aware of the terrible shooting that happened in Christchurch 3 weeks ago, and the outpouring of compassion from people in Christchurch and from around New Zealand to our Muslim population in Christchurch. And I would say some of that is a consequence of the Christchurch earthquakes. I think the compassion level, if you want to call it a compassion quotient and kindness quotient, has grown significantly because of the earthquakes. People looking after one another in that terrible circumstance. And I think that has overflowed to the Muslim community in that terrible tragedy. So there are some silver linings, and we should take advantage of all that we can in the changing environment we live in.
A quick comment again on the how do you make it happen in India. I don't know anything about India, but somebody once, maybe they were facetious, told me, I'm in the business of selling something nobody wants. And so what this means really is that you have no hope unless you can find somebody who wants it. And for Seattle, that was a great example. You got the companies to say we want it. For Christchurch, it may have come in some ways through the population, and indirectly or directly. In some of the cases, you may have to convince the engineers. I mean, in Christchurch, the building code did not change one bit, and the structural systems completely changed overnight, right? So you have to find the entryways as to how to make it happen. There's a project I'm working on high-rise construction that will change completely the way high-rise are designed. And there, the driver was, the engineers like it, but that was not sufficient. The developers have to like it, and they like the fact that it is being built twice the speed of the other system, and so they save on money because they can open faster. And so there's always an angle somewhere, and I don't know where the angle is in India, but you have to have something that they want, otherwise it just won't happen.
Great. Well, let me conclude here. Well, I mean, I think one of the key themes that came through both these questions as well as the conversation here today is that resilience can be not just about that narrow definition in the dictionary of just returning to form. It really can be an impetus for us thinking about transformation. And that's just as true in the developing world as the developed world. So we shouldn't be conservative to some extent on what we think about resilience, that is just trying to get back to or preserve some steady state. There may be some things that we really do want to do that. But it's this potential for resilience to, in fact, allow us to think about how we adapt, how we transform to have more livable, more equitable, more successful societies. That hopefully is what will animate our conversations and ultimately will win over some of the hearts and minds. So if you would, join me in applauding our panelists here and our keynote for making